Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on efficient service stability. This is part 4 of a 4-part series on quantifying DevOps outcomes. My name is Jason McDonald, and I'm pleased to welcome back George Miranda, your technical strategy guide for this series. Before I turn it over to George, I have a couple housekeeping items to cover quickly. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on demand after the live session, accessible through the same link that you're using now. We'd also love to hear from you during today's interactive presentation. Throughout the webinar, we'll prompt you with poll questions like the one we just pushed live asking, have you attended or seen other webinars in this series? Go ahead and send your response to that now, and we'll discuss the results throughout the webinar. We've also dedicated time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. So feel free to send those questions along at any time using the Ask a Question tab beneath your presentation screen. For those of you just joining, welcome to today's presentation on efficient service stability. Let's go ahead and get started. George, why don't you kick us off by telling our audience a bit more about what we'll be covering here today?
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, there's a poll question up to let us know how caught up you are in this web series. Because this is part 4 of a 4-part webinar, in this episode, we're going to tie together many of the concepts that we've seen in earlier installments. Because this is an interactive session, what I'd like to do is use this poll as a way to gauge how much depth I should go into, and if we need to recap concepts from earlier episodes. So please go ahead and answer that poll now if you haven't already done so. And while you're doing that, I should go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is George Miranda. And I help set the direction of technical strategy here at Chef. You'll find me hosting Chef webinars from time to time, but there's something I've particularly loved about this series. First, it's less technically focused than most typical Chef webinars. And that's allowed us to pull back from technical specifics and concentrate around the strategy of what we're trying to achieve and why. These webinars have been aimed at the executive and management level, but I think what's become clear to me as we've gone through them and explored the behaviors that drive business outcomes is I believe this series has become useful for anyone at any level that's interested in understanding why DevOps patterns are shaped as they are. And I think this series also has become valuable for anybody that wants to help set a context around conversations that dive deep into technical implementation, but still have an easy-to-follow bridge back to connected business value. So these discussions have been high level, but even so, some of the associated questions that we've gotten have opened up wider topics that extend down into the practitioner space. So speaking of questions, if we aren't able to get to your questions today in the allotted time that we have, please reach out to me via Twitter, especially since this is the last session in our Quantifying Outcomes series. But the reason that I bring up how we handle questions is that there was a question we didn't get to squeeze into our last webinar, and I'd like to get to that before we dive into today's topic. So looking at our poll, it looks like we should do a little bit of recap, so I'll go ahead and cover this somewhat quickly. So to quickly recap for the folks that are just joining us, in our first session, we explored industry metrics that capture how high-performing IT organizations work and the measures that show us how they outperform their peers. And those figures were staggering, right? Anecdotally, as an IT strategist, I had a feeling that many of the customers I work with are leading their industries. But when we look at the raw data, I think it's significantly better than most would expect, right? It was things like twice the market share, 5 times revenue growth, 8 times the operating profit growth, right? And a number of other eye-opening measures. We didn't spend a ton of time covering this in the first webinar because 88% of you indicated that you understood the value of digital leadership because you're already undergoing some phase of DevOps transformation initiative. So instead, we spent time looking at, well, what exactly is that transformation? What does it entail? How do you know that you're moving in the right direction? And then we spent a little bit of time looking at the State of DevOps report, right? And what that industry data tells us is that there are particular measurable characteristics associated with organizations that have transformed into what are categorized as high-performing IT organizations. And then what Chef has done with that data is we've categorized those measures into this outcome-driven view that you see here on the slide. And this is what we've spent the last few webinars exploring. And we've done that in small bite-sized chunks, right, that allow us to start exploring why each of these concepts matter, that allow us to look at the state of performance in our organizations today, that prompts us to think about where we are and where we want to be, how we are able to get there. And it's allowed us to start breaking down a very large and often ambiguous topic like DevOps transformation, and break that down into an actionable plan designed to get results and reinforce the behaviors that we need in order to drive towards success. And what we've seen so far in these webinars is that everyone tells us that they want to move fast, focus on increasing speed. But as we discovered in our first webinar, right, almost no one was thinking about how to up the safety factor while moving fast, right? And if all you do is drive fast, but you never learn how to stay safe, that's dangerous, right? Because sooner or later, you're going to drive off a cliff. And maybe that's dramatic, right? Maybe that's a small bit of hyperbole, but without hyperbole, we'd all be dead. So we spent our second webinar exploring ways to mitigate risk, right? Focus on safety first because it's imperative, and tragically, that's often overlooked. And I think it worked, right? Because later, 73% of you, or 3 out of 4, later told us that a focus on mitigating risk is now your priority over deciding to first focus on moving fast. And then in our third webinar, we explored pipeline concepts and why they're at the heart of moving quickly. And in that webinar, we had a lot of good questions, and there were some that we didn't have time for. I wrote a follow-up blog post to answer all of the questions we couldn't get to, and there's a link to that post on the bottom of this slide. But one of the metrics for outperforming in terms of speed is to minimize elapsed time between an initial software commit, right, or from the time you develop a new software feature, and having that feature run in production. And the follow-up question I wanted to highlight is the one that you see here, right? How do you measure time from commit to deploy? Is that average time, max time, or other, right? For example, in our environment, we currently deploy once a quarter. Some commits are made months before deployment, and some are made days or hours before deployment. So how do I measure that? And in context of the question, the answer is average, right? But the reason I bring this up during the webinar, even though you could go read this on your own, is that I want to really highlight how all of these metrics work. So what I love about this set of outcome-driven metrics is, and I'll use time from commit to deploy as my example, but this applies to all of the metrics that we've looked at. What I love about these is that on the surface, they may not seem all that groundbreaking, right? Like you hear time from commit to deploy and you probably think like, oh yeah, sure, right? Like I heard a talk about this concept. I know people in the field are doing that, and like, yeah, that's not very surprising. And you might think that, right? But when you start unpacking what it means to achieve a measure where on average you deploy within minutes from the time that you commit, that opens up a much larger view of the organizational culture required to get there, right? You might find yourself thinking, right, well, I only ship once a quarter, so there's no way that's possible, right? That's not how we do it today. In order to achieve that number, that means, I probably couldn't let developed features just sit in source control and not be deployed. Well, like, why do I do that today, right? Maybe I do that today because that feature depends on another feature that isn't developed yet. So I batch those up and I ship them in large chunks. Well, wait, like, why do I ship in batches, right? Maybe I could ship that first feature in a state that's dark. But maybe that feature needs access to a data table that isn't there yet, right? Well, maybe I could also make that data change and ship that feature dark and use a feature flag to test it. But that requires me to rethink the way that I make changes to my data structures, right? And then If I do that, that requires changing how my devs think about writing their code. And if I change that, well, then that change requires changing how my projects are managed. And changing that requires changing how I set expectations with my customers, right? And if I change that, well, that requires rethinking how I set business objectives and requirements, right? And like, bam, right? Yes, exactly. That is how transformation occurs. And I didn't even touch half of the concerns that you might need to rethink in order to deliver on this one seemingly ordinary metric, right? And that is how change, both technological and cultural, ripple throughout your organization. It requires bottom-up practitioner adoption, but it also requires top-down executive support, right? There are a lot of moving pieces, and we all have parts of that we manage. And we all have to do our part in shaping that change, right? And all of that comes from focusing on achieving this one little metric. So I've said it before in the series, and I'll say it again now, hoping that perhaps it has more context. This is a cohesive set of practices, right? You cannot achieve high performance in one category, but not the others. It's doing all of these things that is what it means to transform your practices and outperform. And unpacking what it takes to deliver on all of those measures, that's what drives transformation, right? And these measures are just simply a map that shows us what we're focused on and whether or not that really moves the needle forward, right? And that's how we quantify DevOps outcomes. And that's the entire point of this webinar series, right? How do we take those intangibles of DevOps transformation, right? Those intangibles that anecdotally we've known are happening across the industry, like changing your organizational culture, right? How is that even a thing? And this is how we turn that into an equation where if you focus on achieving these outputs, it requires you to adopt the algorithm of tuning all your variables the right way to achieve a successful DevOps practice. And all of these metrics have a way of feeding back into one another, and that's what I love about these metrics. Clearly there's a lot more you have to do, but these measures reinforce the behaviors that become your culture, that drive your business to outperform. They're the starting point, right? And we can kind of use that as a northern star to navigate by. So today we're going to look at the last in this set of outcomes, which is a focus on increasing efficiency. In other words, how do you get better operational stability? There's another poll question live now, and in this one we'd like to know how your organization does today in terms of recovering from service outages. Is that recovery time measured in minutes, hours, or days? So go ahead and let us know if you haven't done so already. And meanwhile, right, the measures for this category are change failure rate, right? When you make changes to production services, how often do those changes fail? Is that 0 to 15%, 16 to 30%, or is that more than 30% of the time? The other measure is MTTR, right? Mean time to resolve. So when there is an error and services fail, as they inevitably do, how long does it take to restore? Is that measured in minutes, hours, or days? Right? And again, we see measures for low, medium, and high-performing IT organizations. So let's focus on that first metric, which is change failure rate. And managing your change failure rate is all about how we manage test coverage in our application. There's an animated GIF on this slide, and I might regret that choice depending on how this plays back for you. So in case you can't see this, it's looking at how we test a door latching mechanism. The unit test for this latch checks to see if the latch can successfully go from an open position to a closed position. And yes, tested in isolation, that looks like a working latch. But the integration test happens when you try to slide the door open with that latch closed, right? It's with that integration test that we see, oh yeah, like that door totally still opens even though the latch is closed, right? And that's the same thing as, well, worked in dev, right? That's an ops problem now. There's a need for multiple types of automatic testing, and they each have a different focus with a different length of feedback loop. But what matters here is that any place that you have code managing things, right, meaning both your applications and your infrastructure, you should have automatic tests verifying that any change you introduce works in various types of situations. You prevent failures from occurring in production by having proper test coverage. There's also another poll live now, and here we'd like to know what testing coverage looks like in your organization. Let us know, and we'll share results in a follow-up blog post recapping this series. And in our last session, we looked at deployment pipelines and their minimum viable shape. What we didn't talk about, though, was that there are different levels of testing happening in each. And using the latch example, right, if we wanted to make sure that a new design of our door latch is going to work whenever we build a house, this is what proper testing of the latch might look like, right? In the verify stage, it's doing a basic check of latch operation, right? Does it open and close successfully? When we build this new latch into a reusable artifact, right, we may want to run those same tests again, but do some additional checks like a quality check, right? Does this latch open smoothly? Or maybe check security, right? Does it work if we put a lock in it? In our acceptance stage, here's where we would first see an integration test by trying it on a door, right? Can we engage the latch and prevent the front door from opening, right? That's an integration test spots that. In the union phase, right, this is where we test upstream dependencies, which we talked about a little bit. But the question here would be like, where do we use latches, right? Well, we use them on front doors, and we use them on back doors, and maybe bathroom doors, right? We don't use them on closet doors or office doors, or maybe we don't even use them in the family room, right? So there's no need to test those. But maybe in this stage, what we discover is that the front doors and back doors work as expected, but that sliding bathroom door, oh yeah, that's totally broken by this build. And obviously, right, this is a more expensive set of tests. It takes more time to run these and get feedback. So we find that further down the cycle, but we find it before it gets to production. In rehearsal, right, we try installing this new latch on a house that looks like the home that we have in production. And then we rerun the test for the entire house, right? Just test the entire thing. And if all of those pass, then we can go ahead and try it in production. And I know that view is oversimplified, right? But that's testing in a nutshell. And unfortunately, in some organizations, testing isn't a priority. It gets shuffled into technical depth, but it's a priority in order to move fast, right? Because it's that level of testing that helps you detect failure sooner before you get into production, right? Full stop. Like this metric is just that simple. It's all about how you test. And it's a simple metric, but the question then usually becomes, all right, George, well, why do these stats look so weird for medium performers? And as we covered in an earlier session, right, the transition from low to high performing means experimenting with new technology and process. And what we see here is with medium performers, there's an operational dip, right, or what we here at Chef call the operating chasm. And this is where you may be learning through trial and error in order to emerge on the high-performing side, and sometimes you land squarely in the error part of trial and error. So here, it's usually advisable to have a trusted advisor to help steer you through making the right choices for your organization. This is also where, as we covered in the speed webinar, your choice of tools matters. Not because the tools themselves are important, but because the ways in which they make you work by default is what will either steer you towards successful trial or abysmal error. So the important part here, right, as a strategist, is to invest in a set of tools and consulting that will help you avoid that dip and steer clear of the operating chasm. The other metric in the mix is mean time to recover, right? And in an illustration of what I mean about all these metrics leading to one another is that if we have already addressed every other metric that we've discussed in this series, which is compliance testing, the ability to deploy on demand, automated build pipelines to go from commit to production, and proper test coverage for all your changes, you already have all of the tools in place to ensure that if you have a service outage, you're able to roll out a fix to your entire infrastructure within minutes. And if we didn't already have those things and we decided to start with a focus here instead, Then in the course of figuring out how to deliver on the promise of recovery within minutes, at a minimum, we uncover the concept of needing a build pipeline, of needing automated configuration, and maybe needing some proper testing, right? I suppose if you're doing just config management, like using Chef, you could upload a new cookbook by hand and automatically let your Chef clients pick that up. But in tandem with a metric like looking at change failure metrics, then we'd realize there's a need for automated testing and automatic promotion mechanisms to deliver on that goal, right? So these metrics all have a way of reinforcing each other and leading back to the core behaviors that drive transformation. So in our first webinar, I talked a little bit about the tension between speed and risk. And this is at the heart of challenge in most traditionally structured IT organizations, right? Development focuses on speed while operations minimizes risk. But those two goals are at odds, right? The idea behind DevOps transformation is figuring out how to realign teams to deliver software faster, safer, and more reliably. At Chef, right, our view is that the way to do that in large organizations is through vertical integration, right? From the customer, through the business, through development, and through operations, all in the service of learning to ship software fast. And in a nutshell, right, that's what it means to transform into a developer services organization. It means shifting capabilities to match business requirements. And you use the metrics that we've explored as a way to change the way that your teams build, deploy, manage, and collaborate on delivering software to your users, right? And that may seem like a large, ambiguous goal. And I think without clear, defined outcomes and measurable metrics, it is, right? Because without those, organizations will focus on only some of the practices we've defined, but not all, right? Or they fall into the operational chasm because of that. But my goal with this entire series is to shine a light on the practices that drive you toward a successful DevOps transformation. And the way to quantify those practices is to set goals that match delivering in the high performance category for all of the metrics that we've seen. And when your organization adopts DevOps practices, your implementation may not necessarily match those of your peers, right? Your needs for approving changes might be different, or your team structures might be different than they are in other organizations. But it's the act of unpacking what it takes to deliver on those metrics that's what is going to guide you toward the correct behaviors, right? Focus on increasing speed, lowering risk, and increasing operational efficiency. Now, this is a Chef webinar, and I've mostly made it almost all the way through this entire series without talking about specific Chef tools or tooling choices. But I'd be remiss at this point if I didn't mention the Chef Automate platform. And the Chef Automate platform is our commercial product that works with all of our open source tooling and integrates with a lot of other popular tools. And the Chef Automate platform has been engineered to reinforce the default behaviors that we want to see. It's designed to follow the principles and practices that we've discussed. So if you're interested in seeing the product and what drives these behaviors, please reach out. We'll be happy to show you how it all comes together with a little more depth. But I'll go ahead and leave it there, right? Because this is how it all comes together. And this is our high-level introduction, not only into what DevOps transformation is and why it's a competitive advantage in today's marketplace, but also to give you a concrete set of measures to use to quantify those outcomes and turn that into an actionable plan for your organization, right? Clearly, that's just the tip of the iceberg, but I hope our time together has given you a better understanding of how this plays out for your organization. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and joining us in this webinar series, and I'll turn it over to Jason to moderate the Q&A portion of today's webinar.
Thank you, George. We have a few questions already, but if you'd like to ask a question, please click the Ask a Question button below the presentation in your screen. So, George, the first question is there an exact order or recommended order for focusing on these metrics? Which should I go with first, and should I do them, or should I do them all at once?
So the question basically is there a prescriptive path to follow? And again, right, I'd say all of these metrics feed into one another, and basically like all roads lead to Rome, right? But I find that sometimes organizations find it a bit overwhelming to focus on all of them at the same time. right? And transformation is a journey, right? It's not an overnight red eye. Uh, it's kind of like the typical, like like the mythical man month, right? You can't necessarily make it go faster by piling more bodies on it. And so, all of these metrics have their own icebergs beneath those tips that we've been talking about. So my advice would be to just choose one and choose the one that's causing you the most pain, right? Start there. But with that said, if they all equally hurt, or maybe you don't know where to start, I think the same course that was followed by this webinar series is probably a good one to follow, right? Focus on mitigating risk before you try to go fast. Start moving faster, right? But maybe not all the way fast. And then look at how you ensure proper testing is saving you from the edge of that cliff, right? By focusing on efficiency. That's probably how I'd recommend going about it.
Great. So the next question is, what if I just batched up commits before the quarterly release and submitted them all at the same time? Wouldn't that lower the average time from commit to deploy?
That would lower your average time from commit to deploy. But you can game the numbers in any system, right? And I think the point here isn't to deliver, just on the numbers inside of those metrics, which is the driver, right? But I think the point here is to go through a critical exercise in unpacking what it means to really have the capability to deliver on those, right? Because those metrics, they're a reflection of data that comes from studying success patterns across the IT industry. And in a way, right, what they're doing is they're reverse engineering and then communicating what it takes to go through that sort of DevOps transformation, right? And you could go the Potemkin village route, right? And you could put up a facade of buildings instead of actually building a village. But can you live in that, right? Probably not. And I think if you did, right, and you checked that box and called it done, when you got to other metrics like failure rate, there's a built-in check and balance that sort of forces you to think about what's required and go back and do it right. Right? So it's not so much about the numbers, so much as what those numbers force you to have to realize that you need to do.
Thanks. And so it looks like we have time for one more question. So the last question is, do all these principles apply when you're managing containers? It seems like some of the work would already be done in that case. We had a similar question in the last webinar, right? And my answer then was, look, containers are basically an implementation detail. And you still have to manage changes to your running infrastructure and your application, right? And all of those changes, regardless of what you're using to run your infrastructure, still require proper testing and a deployment pipeline, right? They still require you to know what's running inside of those containers and whether or not you have vulnerabilities inside of them. And you still want a very low failure rate when you deploy changes to your running services, right? And all of those things still apply. And I'm not necessarily sure which parts, what work may have already been done for you. I think that depends maybe on the container management solution that you've adopted, right? But most of them, for example, have a deployment methodology, right? And if they do, great, cool, box checked, right? You have a way to roll out changes. But all of the other supporting practices still need to be there, right? And then all of your non-containerized applications, right? All of those applications still need those practices, and I think these apply to all of the applications that you manage, right? So yes, they still apply, and yes, all these metrics should be used to navigate those waters. Thank you, George. So that brings to a close the Q&A and our presentation for the day. We'll be summarizing everything we covered today in a blog post in the coming week. And again, this webinar recording will be available at the URL where you're watching it right now, pretty soon after the conclusion of the presentation. Before you go, we'd love it if you'd take time to rate us using the Rate This tab in your viewer. And we hope you found value in the presentation. And if so, please pass it along to any friends or colleagues who may also see value in it. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.